You heard them before you saw them. Extra, extra, read all about it. The voice cut through the morning air, sharp and urgent, coming from the corner where the streetcar stopped or the steps outside the train station. Sometimes it was a kid, maybe 10 or 12 years old, wearing a flat cap pulled low, a canvas bag slung across his shoulder, his breath visible in the cold. Other times it was an older boy, 16 or 17, who'd been doing this for years and knew exactly how to angle his pitch to catch someone mid-stride. The papers were folded in half, stacked in bundles at his feet, tied with rough twine that left marks on his hands. He'd hold one up, waving it just enough to make you look. The headline was printed in bold black letters, sometimes covering half the front page. War declared. Stock market crashes. Lindbergh lands in Paris. You'd reach into your pocket, pull out a nickel or a dime, hand it over, and he'd pass you the paper without breaking rhythm, already calling out to the next person walking by. This was the newsboy. And for nearly a century, from the 1830s into the 1950s, he was everywhere. On street corners in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit. Outside office buildings and factory gates. At trolley stops and subway exits. Wherever people gathered, wherever foot traffic was heavy, there he was, selling the news. The job wasn't glamorous. It was cold in the winter, hot in the summer, and the hours were long. Most newsboys started before dawn, picking up their papers from the distribution office, carrying them to their assigned corner, and staying until they sold out or the afternoon edition arrived. They worked on commission, buying the papers wholesale and keeping whatever profit they made. If they didn't sell, they didn't eat. But it was a job. And for kids growing up in tenement buildings or working-class neighborhoods, it was often the only job they could get. You didn't need experience. You didn't need to read or write particularly well. You just needed a loud voice, quick hands, and the willingness to stand outside in all weather. Some boys worked alone. Others worked in groups claiming territory, competing for the best corners. There were hierarchies. The older boys got the busiest intersections. The younger ones worked the side streets or the residential blocks where sales were slower. Arguments broke out over who stood where, who got to the train station first, who sold the most papers that week. The newspapers liked the system because it was cheap. They didn't have to pay wages or provide benefits. The newsboys weren't employees. They were independent contractors, tiny entrepreneurs hustling on street corners. The papers got distributed, the boys got paid, everyone else got the news. But the newsboys themselves were living hard lives. Many of them came from families that needed the income. Some were orphans, sleeping in boarding houses or charity shelters, spending what little they earned on food and a bed for the night. Jacob Riis photographed them in the 1890s, small boys with dirty faces, standing in alleys, sleeping on grates to stay warm. The images shocked people who hadn't thought much about where their morning paper came from. By the early 1900s, reform movements started pushing back. Child labor laws were introduced, restricting the hours kids could work and the conditions they could work in. Newsboys were often exempt because they were technically self-employed, but the pressure was building. Schools wanted kids in classrooms, not on street corners. Social workers argued that selling papers wasn't a path to anything, it was just survival. And it was tough. Still, the newsboys kept working. Through the Depression, when a nickel mattered more than ever. Through the war years, when headlines sold themselves and boys ran through neighborhoods shouting about victories and defeats. The job persisted because the system persisted. People bought papers, papers needed to be sold, and someone had to stand on the corner and do it. But by the 1940s and 50s, things were starting to shift. Circulation was changing. Newspapers began relying more on home delivery, sending carriers on bicycles or in cars to drop papers on doorsteps before people woke up. Subscriptions became the preferred model. You paid once a month, and the paper showed up every morning without you having to think about it. It was more reliable, it was more convenient, and it meant fewer people stopping at newsstands or buying from boys on the street. The streets themselves were changing too. Downtowns were spreading out. More people were driving instead of walking. The old patterns, crowds at trolley stops, lines at subway exits, were breaking apart. If you were already in your car, you weren't stopping to buy a paper from a kid on the corner. You were driving straight to work. Radio and television were also starting to compete. By the 1950s, you didn't have to wait for the evening edition to find out what happened. You could turn on the radio and hear it instantly. Later, you could watch it on the evening news. The urgency that had made Newsboys effective, extra, read all about it. didn't carry the same weight when people had already heard the story hours earlier. And then there were the newsstands, small metal kiosks on street corners, operated by adults who sold papers alongside magazines, cigarettes, gum, and candy. They didn't shout, they didn't move, they just stood there, and people came to them. The model was quieter, more permanent, and it didn't rely on children working long hours in rough conditions. The newsboys didn't disappear all at once. You could still find them in some cities into the 1960s, especially in places where commuter traffic was heavy or where the old rhythms held on a little longer. But their numbers were shrinking. The corners that had once held 2 or 3 boys now had none. The shouts faded. The stacks of papers moved indoors. By the 1970s, the newsboy was mostly gone. A few remained in niche markets, selling specialty papers outside stadiums or political rallies. But the job as it had existed for generations was over. The last of them grew up, found other work, and moved on. The corners stayed empty. What replaced them wasn't worse exactly. Home delivery was more efficient. Newsstands were more convenient. Subscriptions were easier to manage. People still got their news. They just got it differently. But something was lost in the transition. The newsboy had been part of the rhythm of the street. He'd been a fixture, a voice, a presence. You knew him, or you recognized him, or at the very least you heard him every morning on your way to work. He was woven into the fabric of daily life in a way that a newspaper dropped on your porch at 5 a.m. never could be. He was also a reminder of how things used to work. A kid could go out, hustle, make a few dollars, and feel like he was contributing. It wasn't easy, it wasn't fair, but it was something. And for boys growing up in hard circumstances, it was often the only something they had. The job vanished because the world it had been built for changed. The streets, the circulation models, the competition from other media, the labor laws, the way people moved through their days, all of it shifted, and the newsboy couldn't shift with it. Understanding that doesn't erase the image. The boy on the corner, waving the paper, shouting the headline, the canvas bag across his shoulder, the cold morning air, the sound of his voice cutting through the noise. Those are part of the story, and they're part of what's gone. If this brought back memories, if you remember buying a paper from a newsboy, or if you were one yourself, or if your grandfather told you stories about standing on a corner in the freezing cold trying to sell the evening edition, please like this video. Subscribe if you'd like more of these quiet looks at how ordinary things gradually changed. And if you remember something I didn't mention, leave a comment. I'd like to hear it. The newsboy vanished because the world moved on, but the memory stays.